Some of you guys are probably familiar with Worldtimer complications on watches. That's a complication that allows you to see the time anywhere in the world just at a glance by looking at the dial of the watch. But something I think a lot less people have seen is a Worldtimer watch that's actually affordable, particularly when you're talking about automatic watches or automatic watches with Swiss movements. Usually you're jumping up into the luxury watch territory and that unattainable luxury watch price zone. But today we're taking a look at a Worldtimer watch from a micro brand, and they're going to be launching this one at Kickstarter for $685. Today we're taking a look at the Batavi Geograf Worldtimer. Hi guys, welcome back to Just the Watch. My name's Dave. I live in Japan and I love to collect affordable watches. And I'm not from Japan originally, as you can probably tell. I'm originally from California back in the United States. So I have a lot of friends and family back there, and through this YouTube channel I've gotten to know people kind of all over the world in all sorts of different time zones. So for me, one of the most useful things a watch can do is tell me what time it is in other time zones. And so I love GMT watches. But today we're looking at a watch that has an even more useful complication, which is the Worldtimer complication. So this is a complication that shows you the time in every time zone on the world. You don't need to use the bezel to look things up. It's just always there. And normally this is a complication that we tend to associate more with luxury watches, or at least watches in the $1,000 and up price range. But Batavi, a micro brand based out of Amsterdam, has done something really interesting in finding a way to produce a watch that has a Swiss automatic movement and a Worldtimer complication. And they're going to be launching this at a price well under $1,000. And they found a really kind of cool, creative way to do this at an affordable price. We're going to be getting into all that in just a minute, but let's start by looking at the specifications, dimensions, and price. Now, this watch that we're looking at today is a prototype from Batavi, and as such, there are going to be some changes to the production unit, which I'll mention as we go in the review. One of them, there is a pretty major error on this prototype that they will fix, and it's a pretty easy fix. We'll get into all that in a second. However, this prototype is one that I borrowed for the review. I've actually already sent it on to the next reviewer. However, Batavi did let me know that if the campaign is successful, they will be giving me a production unit to keep, which is why you saw the paid promotions flag at the beginning of this video. However, other than the promise of a watch, Batavi did not provide any compensation for this review, nor did they have any input into the content of this review. The Batavi Geograf Worldtimer has a 39mm case with 20mm lugs, including the domed sapphire crystal. It is just about 13mm thick. You're getting a kind of longer 48mm lug to lug, an impressive 200 meters of water resistance, and inside this watch is using a Swiss Soprod C125 GMT movement, which they've used to actually find a way to implement a Worldtimer complication. This watch will be launching on Kickstarter at an early bird price of around $685, with a planned full retail price somewhere around $895. Okay, now we got to talk about how exactly this thing works. How does it show the time in all the different time zones? We got to talk about this movement because this is an unusual movement. But before we get into those technical issues, let me talk a little bit about just what I like about this watch. Because for me, this is one of the most exciting micro brand releases I've seen. There are a couple of things I think make this watch really cool. The first is their implementation of the Worldtimer complication. This is a complication that I really love, and yet it's something that you really don't see in automatic watches in this price range. And yet, by taking a standard off-the-shelf automatic GMT movement and swapping the GMT hand out with a 24-hour ring, they've managed to implement that complication in a very cost-effective way. And on top of that, they've done it with just a really gorgeous design. The colors that they've chosen for that 24-hour ring are fresh and fun, and the inner rotating bezel on which the world cities are printed is just a really cool touch. It keeps everything very clean and uncluttered, and the 10 o'clock crown to operate that inner rotating bezel gives it an interesting asymmetrical look. The other thing that I like about it is just how they've picked a really wearable size and combined that with a great comfortable build quality. The result is a watch that is easy to wear, that looks interesting, and has an amazing and useful complication on it. And when you combine all that and put it into a watch that you're going to launch at around $700, there's not really much competition that I'm aware of. And that's going to make this watch a very attractive option for a lot of people. For me, that Worldtimer complication is the thing that really makes this watch special. Let's talk a little bit about how exactly that works so you can kind of wrap your head around it before we go any further. First, rather than featuring a standard GMT hand, this watch features a 24-hour ring that makes one complete rotation once every 24 hours. And there are two ways that you can use this ring at the same time. The first would be to set it to a second time zone. This can be done by pulling the crown out to the second position and then rotating it clockwise. From there, I would just set it so the hour in the second time zone that I wanted to track was lined up with the 12 o'clock marker on the dial. Then by looking just underneath the 12 o'clock marker, I could always see what time it was in that second time zone that I set. In order to synchronize that up with the Worldtimer, all you would need to do next is rotate that Worldtime bezel so that the name of the city that you're tracking that you set as the second time zone is also lined up at 12 o'clock on the dial. Once that's done, you can look at any city on that bezel and then look at where the 24-hour ring is lined up, and that will tell you what time it is in that city. Now, this watch is a prototype and they made a fairly large printing mistake. The Worldtime cities are actually printed in reverse order from how they could be useful with this 24-hour ring. So on the prototype, everything is off and it doesn't really function, but that's a very simple thing to do. All they need to do is just print the cities in the correct order and everything will line up and work properly. But if you're looking at this and saying, hey, that's not the right time at that city, that's why. All in all, I absolutely love this complication. It's just so cool to see that 24-hour ring kind of slowly making its way around the dial and then being able to really reference any time you want in any place in the world. One other kind of interesting feature that opens up by putting the Worldtime cities on a rotating bezel is that you can use it to look up times in the future as well. For instance, let's say I wanted to schedule a meeting for 9 a.m. here in Japan and I had a friend in Los Angeles and I wanted to tell him what time that meeting would be for him. I could use the Worldtime cities to rotate the bezel so that Tokyo lines up with 9 on that 24-hour ring. And then by glancing over at Los Angeles on the bezel and then looking at where that's lined up with on the 24-hour ring, that would tell me what time it would be in Los Angeles at 9 a.m. here in Japan. Now, I think things might have been a little bit simpler if they would have just put a fixed bezel in there instead of a rotating one, but I kind of like the extra functionality and customizability that that extra bezel gives you, and overall, yeah, I think I prefer it this way. Now, powering this Worldtimer complication is actually just a standard GMT movement. So it's really cool how Batavi kind of found a way to rework this standard movement to give you that Worldtimer complication, which really helps to keep the cost affordable. But the movement inside that they're using is one that I am not that familiar with. It's from one of the lesser known Swiss movement manufacturers, Soprod. Here's my experience with that movement so far and what I've been able to find out about it. The movement in this watch is a Swiss Soprod C125 GMT movement. Now, Soprod is one of the smaller Swiss movement manufacturers, at least compared to brands like Sellita and ETA. And because of that, they don't have quite the track record that Sellita or ETA has. However, I've generally heard pretty good things about them. And personally, I wouldn't have any hesitation picking up a watch that had one of their movements in it. This GMT movement is kind of one of their lesser known movements. It hasn't really been used in a lot of watches. So again, maybe not a very long track record here. But it is Swiss made. It beats at 28,800 beats per hour, or about 8 ticks per second, which results in a noticeably smooth sweep on that second hand. You get a 42-hour power reserve and, perhaps most importantly, a GMT complication. The movement also features bidirectional winding, hacking and hand winding, and the hand winding is very smooth. I could not find any accuracy numbers published by Soprod on what you can generally expect from this movement. However, the review sample that I have in is running very accurately at right around +1 second per day. Finally, the movement is very nicely finished, so you can appreciate it through the see-through case back on the back of the watch. Now, the C125 does also feature a date complication. However, Batavi has chosen not to implement that on this watch. I believe that the limitations of the design and the implementation of that Worldtime 24-hour ring kind of make it impossible to include the date complication as well. But the end result of that is that you are going to have a ghost date on this watch. Now, complications and innovations aside, Is the watch really any good? How's the design? These are very important questions that need to be answered, because while this watch is very affordable for a watch that has a Swiss automatic movement and a Worldtimer complication, it's still probably not what most normal people would consider to be an affordable watch. And for myself included, if I was thinking about purchasing this watch, this would be a stretch. So let's see how this watch holds up on the design and build quality front.
This is a really good looking watch. The overall design language feels very minimalistic and modern to me, and yet that bicolor 24-hour ring in the middle of the dial really adds a unique look to this watch. And the second crown at 10 o'clock also makes the case design look a little bit more interesting as well. This gray colorway features kind of a muted, primarily monochrome look to it. The dial hands markers are all silver with white accents and white printing, which really helps that bicolor 24-hour ring with its sort of teal and orange colors really pop off the dial. Now, because this colorway does not have a lot of contrast, there is a hit to legibility, which we'll talk more about when we get to the cons section of this review. There's not a lot of text on the dial, but the text that is there is done in a couple of fairly interesting fonts that I think I overall like. The script used for the watch name Geograf at 6 o'clock I think adds kind of a cool touch to the watch. However, underneath it, the printing where it says Worldtimer is extremely tiny, to the point that I had a pretty difficult time reading it with the naked eye. Likewise, the word Amsterdam under Batavi at 12 o'clock is also very small. While the overall case and bracelet are pretty simple, there's a lot of really great finishing and accents that kind of make it a lot more interesting than you would initially think. I particularly like the bezel that they've gone with on this. It features a high polished beveled edge that slopes up to meet a flat portion across the top of the watch, and the top of that bezel has an interesting radial brushing that almost gives the illusion that it's kind of sloping downward towards the crystal. The lugs are a little bit longer than you would typically expect on a 39mm watch, and the 48mm lug to lug that you get on this really looks great on my 7 1/4 inch wrist. I kind of like that combination of a moderate 39mm case size with kind of a slightly longer lug to lug. To me, this feels like it wears closer to a 40 or even a 41mm size. The H-link bracelet also perfectly matches the watch with great finishing, with polished center links and brushed outer links. It's got female end links, really high articulation, and just a great solid feel. Likewise, the clasp features great finishing. It's got 4 micro adjusts and a really pleasing to use dual push button deployant. For sizing the bracelet, you do get screw links as well as quick release spring bars on the bracelet, so you can swap it over to something different if you would like. Overall, I think this is a really solid design that's very easy to wear. And with 200 meters of water resistance and a stainless steel bracelet, you've got a watch that can be used as a sports watch or as kind of a casual or even slightly dressy piece. So you've got a lot of versatility here as well.
If you guys are interested in getting a cool t-shirt like this, check out my website, justthewatch.com. I've got this design and a lot of other kind of cool watch-themed t-shirts. So I was immediately kind of hooked with this watch because of the complication that's on it. I like the overall style and look from the pictures, and I've had a ton of fun with it since I've had it in hand. But it's not a perfect watch.
Now, I kind of have a lot of nitpicks with this watch. There's a couple of minor things that bug me a little bit, but these are generally things that I'm willing to overlook because I think the Worldtimer implementation is so cool and unique. For me, the biggest challenge is the legibility on this gray dial colorway, and the fact that I found some of the other colorways to be kind of hit and miss. Now, on the gray dial, I really like the choice of colors. I think the gray looks great, and I like the kind of orange and teal ring, but outside of that 24-hour ring, there's not a lot of contrast on this watch. The small printing for the World Time cities is very difficult to read, not only because the text is so tiny, but also because it's white on gray, again, lacking in contrast. Likewise, the hands and applied markers all kind of disappear in certain lighting as everything just kind of has this same metallic look to it. I would have liked this a lot better if they could have made those individual elements kind of really pop off the dial. And I think the blue dial version is going to have a lot better legibility and contrast. But on that one, I'm kind of on the fence with the sort of green and gray 24-hour ring. The second thing that I'm a little bit on the fence with is the use of that inner rotating bezel for the World Time cities. I think things could have been a little bit more intuitive and simple if that was a fixed bezel. But that said, I do think I still prefer it this way. I like that added kind of customization and a little bit of extra functionality that you can squeeze out of that rotating bezel. More of a concern to me is that on some of the colorways, rather than using a Worldtime Cities bezel, they've used a 12-hour bezel. And typically I'm a big fan of 12-hour bezels. They're a great way to add a dual time functionality to a movement that doesn't have a GMT hand. But on a watch that has not only a GMT hand, but a 24-hour GMT ring, I feel like the 12-hour bezel is kind of out of place. To me, it's even less intuitive to have that 12-hour bezel on there than the Worldtime Cities one. I think some of those look great visually, but for me, I would definitely be leaning towards the one with the Worldtime Cities so that you can get that full actual Worldtimer functionality on your wrist, because again, to me, that's one of the coolest things about this watch and the biggest selling points of it. Finally, a couple of other minor design quibbles. Once again, I wish there was some way they could have included a date on this watch rather than having a ghost date implementation. And that 24-hour ring is kind of separated from the bezel, making it a little bit more difficult to read. Legibility would have been much better if that 24-hour ring was lined up directly next to the bezel to make it easier to see it. In this case, you kind of have to jump from the bezel over the 12-hour hour markers on the dial in order to check the time. Again, with this movement, I'm not sure if there is a way that they could have actually done that, but it does make it a little bit more difficult to read. Overall, for me, this is one of the more exciting Kickstarter launches that I've seen. And Batavi's a really interesting brand. They have some really fun, colorful designs that they've been working on, and they're definitely ones I'll be keeping tabs on going forward. Interesting note, they did also mention that they're hoping to move away from Kickstarter in the future, which generally I think is a good thing. It shows some kind of maturing of the brand and shows that they're not going to be as dependent on the Kickstarter funding. And it's also good to note that this is not Batavi's first time at Kickstarter. They have successfully launched a few watches in the past, so that gives you kind of some extra peace of mind when you're thinking about which campaigns to back. But anyways, drop me a comment down below. Let me know which one you like the best. And also, if you know of any other Worldtimer watches in this price range or lower, let me know, because again, this is a complication that I really love, but I hardly ever see it. Anyways, that's going to wrap it up for this review. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you later. Bye.